Okay, chapter 27, a troublesome agreement. A troublesome disagreement. Leonard. Leonard was Miss Mary Ann's baby. Leonard wrote the letter to Rose. He used letters cut from the newspapers heaped in his shed. He rolls them up and burns them in a bucket to keep warm. He's not the only person to have newspapers, said Hector. He is the only person whose father, or guardian, or whatever he is, a man with the same last name, wrote a letter to the lawyer. I rattled the handle of Mr. Standfast's case. He's the only person to have received an allowance from Rose's father every month for all his life. Hector looked as gobsmacked as I felt. I don't know exactly what turned him into a murderer, I said, or why he wrote the letter, or where Rose has gone, but I think I know what happened on Saturday morning. Hector blinked. On Saturday he visits the mermaid room to collect the flower vases, yes? Yes, and he finds Mrs. Irma Eversham is in a tizzy, waving the letter that he wrote to Rose. She is furious at Miss Mary Ann for having a baby 18 years ago, for having him. But Leonard didn't realize. Threads of the puzzle flew in from several directions at once, tangling themselves together. Two nodded to make sense of it at the moment. Leonard didn't know that Miss Mary Ann was his mother. He must have believed that he belonged to Irma and Captain Eversham, and that he might inherit some of the captain's wealth. That's why he wrote the letter, to appeal to Rose directly, brother to sister. I explained that to Hector, but then he arrived at the dance studio, and there was Mrs. Eversham in a furious snit about his private letter. He fears that he will suffer from the wrath of this woman, said Hector. Miss Mary Ann offered her sister-in-law a cup of tea, I guessed, to calm her down. Maybe Leonard was in the pantry getting water, pouring it out from the flowers. Mrs. Eversham is alarming him. He thinks any minute she will call for the police and tell them lies as she is threatened. He wishes to stop her. The pantry has vermrid, I said, washing up powder, cocoa, lemon biscuits all together on a little shelf. He makes a mixture, said Hector. Perhaps he is intending sickness only, just that she stopped shouting. The hotel sugar bowl is there from the night before, I said. Roddy has rinsed the teacups and put them away. The kettle is on the hob. Leonard is a conjurer, said Hector. Mixing poisons into a bowl of sugar is no trouble to someone who extracts the sense pins from behind my ear. Remember how I used to do the tricks, right? But it all went terribly wrong, I said. Mrs. Eversham died. Danger is closing in. He feels trapped. Rose knows he argued with her mother, but not the reason. Maybe he just wanted to talk to Rose. But what if... I hurried toward the door, feeling for my gloves in the pockets of my coat. What if she needs help? We've got to save her. No, said Hector, shaking his head. It is not for us to face a murderer, he said. We are perhaps more clever than the police, but we are not as strong. Let us speak with the inspector or with Constable Beck, or summon Mr. Standfast from the jail cell. We will tell them of your suspicions and... No! I wrenched the door open. They think we're children. Rose could die before they believe us. Are you coming or not? So which would you have done? Would you go get the police? Go get Mr. Standfast? Take off? Try to save Rose? They take off. Hector shook his head and turned toward the sergeant, who now was dozing behind the desk. Too much time had already blown by. I barreled out into the foggy night. Outside the police station, I hurried downhill toward the harbor. 2 minutes later, I stopped running, already persuaded that Hector might have been right. I could see nothing at all before me. A dank, drizzly fog obscured every familiar building along the road. My long curls drooped, my coat was gilded with silvery drops, my skirt and stockings clung to my legs like damp compresses. I trailed my hand along the rain-slick walls of the buildings, meeting window frames and door gaps, trusting that I would eventually edge my way to the waterfront. My breath caught when I heard the clip-clop of a horse's hooves and the ring of wheels on cobbles. But Belle's harness had no jingling bell, so it was not the cart that I hoped to meet. Though I was moving slowly, my mind began to race. How had Leonard persuaded Rose to leave without me? Where did she think she was being driven? Had he played a trick to purchase her cooperation? When did she realize that she was alone with the man who had killed her mother? I thought Leonard to be a friend, but had not seen beyond his disguise, those genial brown eyes. He'd hidden so much hurt in this disguise I understood. I hid my grief from Papa and my shyness every day, pretending to be braver and more eloquent than I knew myself to be. And Hector, whether he liked it or not, was forced to become a new person in a whole different language. Everyone, I supposed, had pieces to hide or to offer as we dared, or did not dare, to face other people. And as for people in disguise, I stumbled off the curb and stumbled again, stepping back onto it. Mr. Fibley, a woman! I should have known when I noticed those eyelashes. No, I should have known the moment Tony began to bark. Dear, clever Tony, trying to protect his mistress from mysterious strangers, mysterious women. How bold to chop off her hair. What would she look like with long hair properly up, the way my sister wore hers? Did she wear a dress when she visited her mother, with a lace collar and a cameo brooch at her throat? I suppose that Hector and I would never see her that way. Her revelation must be our well-kept secret. My breath came raggedly as I paused to wipe my face. My gloves, no better than wet flannels, the fingertips were blackened from trailing through grime on the walls that led me here. I peeled them off and flung them into the gutter. Tony must be pining for me, waiting for an ear scratch before bed. Mummy would be worried, too, at how long we were. Granny perhaps would soothe her, but be wondering also. They believed me to be with Rose, after all. What harm could come? If they knew the truth. That I was stumbling along a darkened street trying to find Rose in time to save her. Hector was right. I should have never set out alone. But here I finally was, arrived on the strand. I could smell fish and the briny tang of the sea itself. Boats creaked as they strained against wet ropes, water slapped against pilings. The fog was thicker by the water. I made myself stand for a moment, long enough to hear my own breath and then the lonely cry of a seagull. Questions swarmed in a frightening cluster, blowing away all logic. If only Hector were here. But panic would not help. Hector would ask one question at a time and answer it sensibly before moving to the next. I preferred to invent stories to make up what people might say to each other, to try out more than one path toward an ending. Perhaps if I used both methods at once, I could be the inspector asking questions and then I'd answer them myself. Thank you for assisting us, Miss Morton. I aimed for a gruff detecting voice, but it came out breathless with my hurrying. Where are you going? To the Royal Victoria Hotel. And why do you suppose, the inspector's voice lingered on the word, that was their destination? I saw a faint yellow glow nearby and then another a few yards farther down. The lamps along the harborside promenade. I found the railing and moved forward, watching for the next pale light. Miss Morton. The hateful answer to why Leonard was taking Rose toward the hotel crawled out from the cobwebbiest corner of my mind. Because, I whispered, Leonard wants people to think that Roddy Fusswell is the killer. If Rose is hurt near the hotel, Roddy will be blamed. Hurt? Or killed. I could not bring myself to say it out loud, even in a fictional conversation with myself. But I knew I was right. Okay, chapter 28. I don't like the title. The title says, A Lonely Scream. Uh-oh. Hector and I had told Leonard on Saturday afternoon about the murder. We told him about the murder he had committed. We'd asked him to bury the rabbit and told him about Mrs. Eversham, while already he was scheming. Leonard told us, bold as brass, that Roddy was being particular about packing up the teacups. He diverted our attention from the very first minute, just like a conjurer. Why had I not seen this before? Logical answer, because I liked Leonard, and I never imagined deceit or evil. Ugh! I tripped over what turned out to be a whopping great coil of rope. Then bump! The railing took a sharp left turn and I'd hit the corner full on. Here the street turned from running around the harbor to climbing the hill toward the hotel. Please let me find Rose. But why? Why does some kind and handsome Leonard dislike Mrs. Eversham so much that he wanted to kill her? I did not know for certain. Hector and I had guessed that he was afraid of the harm her fury might cause, but now I wondered. If he believed she was his mother and had cast him away, first as an infant and again this week, must he not hold fury too? and hurt beyond bearing? Only Leonard could tell us that. I was stilled by a thought, hand to my lips. Perhaps it should be Leonard's voice I summoned instead of the inspector's, to learn his truth from behind his eyes. Could I do that? The villains trounced by Sherlock Holmes were not given much to say for themselves. No book I'd ever read was narrated by a murderer. Which, by the way, she ended up doing that as a Agatha Christie whenever... This is Aggie, like they based this character off Agatha Christie, the actual crime novelist that has written, gosh, she's the most famous, you'll read them when you get into middle school and upper school. She's the most famous crime author out there. So, and Agatha Christie ended up, that was one of the big, like it was a big ordeal that she wrote a book that had the murderer be the narrator. And when people realized it, they were all upset. Of course, now it's like, amazing and everybody thinks it's great, but back when it happened, people were upset. So Aggie is actually kind of throwing a little hint to you about Agatha and the fact that she later in her life might end up writing a book with the murderer as the narrator. So, but killers, I imagine, carried more than their share of sorrow. Why else would they be so reckless with the hearts of others? A noise very nearby. I stopped, dead still. An odd snuffling noise, then a creak and a scrape, as if something heavy were shifting over cobbles. Rose? Might she be muffled by a gag? Rose! I hadn't meant to shout, but what if... And then a snort, a real, live, horsey snort. Belle? A soft whinny in response. Belle? I lunged forward and bumped smack into Belle's wet and wonderful flank. Dear Belle, I found you. A giddy laugh escaped. I'd got to the right place. If only you could tell me where to find Rose. She must be nearby, with her captor. Tears bubbled up on top of the laughter. I was only nearly to Rose and didn't know where to go next. The fog choked the world under a woolly blanket. I draped an arm as high as I could over Belle's back and bumped my forehead against the horse's side. Once, twice, 3 times. What happens next? Leonard, where have you taken her? Belle stood quietly, occasionally lifting and dropping a hoof. Where would I go to scare someone silly? Somewhere isolated. Somewhere that felt like a trap. The killer, and this is her thinking, right? Doing her little, how she dreams in her head and writes. The killer, cornered by his own wicked deeds, imagined that he had one last chance to cast the blame elsewhere. Ignoring the girl's frightened pleading, he forced her out of the cart and prodded her down the slippery stone path to the small protected beach at the bottom of a scary ridge of rock. I knew exactly where they were. The Royal Victoria Hotel sat on a cliff overlooking the ladies' bathing cove and the sea beyond. Where better to pretend that the victim had been pushed over the edge by the son of the hotel manager? What better place to construct another crime scene? It was a bit of a scrabble in the dark to clamber down the slippery, pebbly slope, but my new certainty drove me to the water's edge without hesitation. The sea rumbled steadily behind a curtain of near white mist. Of the whole huge ocean, I could see only a pearly ribbon of foam tumbling against the shoreline. I wanted desperately to call out a warning to Rose, but that would have alerted Leonard that I was stalking him. How had he got Rose this far? Had he knocked her senseless? When Hector saw her slumped in the cart, had she already been dead? I paused to wipe my face and realized how loudly my boots had been crunching on the stones. Standing still, I listened hard. Waves scraped the stones, a seagull called, another seagull answered, and then a scream. I crouched to untie my laces. I slid out of my boots and moved softly in stockinged feet, a boot on each hand like a monstrous paw. Mummy would go into fits if she could see. I sidestepped a boulder and felt squishy spikes of seaweed through my stockings. I was too wet to care. Wait, what was that noise? I closed my eyes to better hear. Voices. Yes. Truly voices, one low and one higher, angry, but alive. An odd blur of notes as if the speakers had swallowed fog and their words turned to billowy mist. And then another choked cry. I wrenched the boots off my hands and flung them away. I skittered across the beach but lost my sense of direction at once. The fog had wrapped me inside a cloud. Very close by, someone else's footsteps crunched on sand, scaring a whimper from my throat. Not a fine sleuthing moment for me. The footsteps went quiet. Could one small whimper end up killing a person? Then, ooh! A shove sent me to the ground. My shoulder and cheek hit the gravelly beach with a scraping crash. Before I could catch my breath, arms snatched me up as my right leg buckled in pain. I stumbled forward, prodded by mean knuckles pointing in my back. The assailant's other hand clamped over my face, damp fingers squashing my nose and jamming my mouth shut. I tried to bite him, but he held on tight, pushing me roughly over several yards of the stony ground until he shook me to a stop. Up, he said. What did he mean? Up! I lifted a foot and found a step. I lifted the other foot and met a second step. Leonard, I whispered, don't hurt me. If you just let things alone, he muttered. I opened my eyes and found a door 2 inches from my face. A wooden door painted the color of a robin's egg. His arm reached across to open it, hurling me through in one swift, unfriendly action. Leonard! I cried. The door slammed shut. I pounced on the handle, but he had managed to make it secure. Was he leaning against it? Was there a lock? I began to shriek. Don't do this! Let me out! Where is Rose? Leonard, can you hear me? His answer was a hard smash against the outside of the handle of the door. He used a rock or some other heavy thing to disable the latch. I knew where I was. Inside a bathing hut. I had been inside a bathing hut every week of every summer of my life. On the outside, it was brightly painted, the striped roof, a banner for summer pleasures. The wheels were as tall as my shoulders, built for rolling into the waves. But inside, on a foggy night in October, I was surrounded by the darkest dark I'd ever known. It was small, I knew that much. All 4 walls were only just beyond the reach of my stretched wide arms. The floor lurched. I was knocked from my feet and landed on my bottom. The hut was moving. Leonard, stop! I hollered. I don't like this. Another pitching lurch. I heard the wheels grinding as I bounced over the shingle beach. Where was he taking me? Then quite a different feeling. I knew it at once. From the many warm, delicious summer afternoons I'd spent in this cove. The moment when the bathing hut leaves the beach and rolls into the sea. Too heavy to float, but the water took some of the weight, holding the tiny house like a child in arms, rocking ever so slightly, and the water, cold seawater, swirled in through the bottom slats like the contents of a spilled bucket on the kitchen floor. Don't leave me here! I heard splashing as he waded away. He literally rolled this hut thing into the ocean. He was well past listening, no longer the Leonard I thought I knew. The old Leonard would never have pushed me about or stuck me in a locked box. Out there somewhere, Rose had screamed. What had he done to her? Was she drowned in the frigid water? The girl's hair floated up around a face as pale as cold ashes, but no less beautiful in death. Or was she, too, trapped in a hut, awaiting the incoming tide? The sea whooshed up through the cracks of the floor, subsided and whooshed again. Bathing huts were not built to be watertight, only to ease ladies' entry into the waves and to protect their modesty from the prying gaze of uncouth men. So I don't know. We'd have to look those up. I guess it's like these little boxes that they would put them in so that they could kind of enjoy the water without people seeing them in their bathing suits. I don't know. I was up to my ankles in seawater as icy as melted snow. Waves in October, especially after a rainstorm, are insistent and swollen. Several rushed in every minute, tipping the hut back and then forward as they gurgled out again. But not all gurgled out. I was standing in more water each time, though I knew the tide could not be coming in so quickly as that. The hut was rolling deeper with each wave. I hurled myself against the door, wishing it to tear wide open like a screen paper. Alas, it was as hard as one would expect from a wooden door. My shoulder, already sore from colliding with the ground, throbbed in outrage. I sank to the floor, tears creeping into my eyes, but then dragged myself upright, wetter than ever. Whoosh! Another wave wrapped my clothing about me like clammy seaweed. I was tilted backward, my ankles immersed and then my knees. The wave receded and the hut tipped forward, emptying the flood back into the sea. I shifted my weight with each ebb and flow as if learning to stand in a rowboat. My knees bumped against the small slatted bench that was meant for sitting upon when adjusting one's woolly swim stockings. I climbed to stand upon it and stretched to see whether I could reach the window. My fingers touched the lip of the opening, but even if I'd had the agility of a monkey to hoist myself up, my body could never squeeze through there. I heard Hector's voice in my head. We are perhaps more clever than the police, but we are not as strong. I could never rescue Rose by myself. I could scarcely push the sopping hair from my face. If Charlotte were here, she'd smooth away my hair and wrap me in a sun-baked towel, and no doubt remind me that if she had accompanied us to town, I would not be in such a predicament. Only I could get myself out of the icy puddle. Think, Aggie, think. I squeezed my eyes shut and imagined being warm, being too warm, as often happened on a humid afternoon in July. Charlotte and I walked all the way from Groveland through the town, around the harbor, and finally to the ladies' bathing cove. I tried to conjure up bright heat and sticky perspiration, the tickling anticipation of arriving on the beach and the sea waiting. I imagined hopping up the wooden steps right behind Charlotte into the dim and suffocating hut, changing into my bathing costume as speedily as ever I could, and then, as soon as Slowpoke Charlotte was ready to, I would unhook the fastener that opened the shuttered doors facing the sea. Silly goose! Silly shivering and waiting to be drowned goose. I'd been trying to think how to get through the door when the opposite side of the hut was designed to open like a picture window for the very purpose of inviting bathers to enter the sea. I smacked my hands against the middle of the wall, just above my own height. Yes, a hook was attached on one side, sunk into a metal loop on the other. My tug freed the hook, easy as pie, as Mrs. Corner would say, though my definition as easy would certainly not be making a pie. Eating pie? Maybe. I'd miss supper. Hunger on top of all the other miseries. I'd think about pie to keep my strength up as the hut pitched again. The unhooked shuttered doors creaked open to reveal the night. The pooling tide, thank goodness, was still below the doorstep. I sent a small word of thanks to the heavens. These few minutes of being trapped had seemed like hours. Outside my prison, the fog had begun to disperse, now swirling instead of merely lying over the world like thick dust. Bam! The shutters slapped shut as the hut tipped backward toward another flood of water against my calves. On a shining summer day, the shutters would be fixed in place by the sturdy and muscular Russian Betty, guardian of the lady bathers. But then, she'd then pull the hut into the surf and assist young ladies in making a genteel entry into the waves. Charlotte took an age to edge her way down the steps, but I liked to stand on the threshold and plunge in with a splash. A plunge would not be so fun tonight. The sky was black, the water was black and churning and frigid, but I could not hesitate another moment. I tugged off my sodden woolly jacket, now as heavy as the sheep it had come from. My skirt should probably come off as well, so as not to impede my motion in the water, but my fingers were too numb to succeed with buttons. The next wave came in. I hauled myself up to the ledge. Blackberry pie, I said in a prayer, and jumped. And that's the end of the chapter. Look, we got, like, really, anything love.